Hello and welcome to The Weekly Witch, brought to you by TwoSalem.com, the home for all things Salem, history, Halloween, witchcraft, and more. This show features interviews and updates from Salem, the world of the esoteric, fiction, film, and many other areas, all aimed at developing a deeper, richer connection with the spooky, witchy, and divine. Please consider supporting this show on Patreon or by subscribing to the platform upon which you are consuming this content. My name's Joel. Now let's get weird, witches. For as long as I can remember, the creatures of folklore and mythology have absolutely captivated me. But it wasn't until I got into exploring the world of the esoteric that I came upon perhaps the most startling realization about such beings. Some of them are actually real, or at the very least, grounded in very real spiritual practices. Now, the term fairy appears in European folklore as a sort of catch-all term to describe a range of types of spirits. Some other familiar creatures from folklore that have at times been lumped in with fairies include goblins and gnomes, but generally, these spirits are small in stature, humanoid, and wield magical powers such as enchantment and protection. My guest today is Morgan Daimler. Now, Morgan has been thinking about fairies and their place in folklore, myth, and spirituality for a really long time. She teaches classes and writes about Irish myth, magical practices, fairies, and much more. Some of her work includes Gods and Goddesses of Ireland, Fairycraft, Irish Paganism, and many, many more. Please check out her Amazon page. There's tons of really quality stuff there for you to peruse. I asked Morgan to come on the show because I was really fascinated to learn how she views fairies as both mythological figures and ones incorporated into her own spiritual practice as a Wiccan. The conversation was absolutely enchanting, and I very, very much hope you agree with that. If you are interested in a sort of introductory approach to what fairies are and what their place currently is in witchcraft and Wicca, head over to twosalem.com for an article that will really get you up to speed with a lot of the stuff that Morgan is going to be talking about in this episode. So thanks very much to Morgan Daimler for coming on the show, and I hope you enjoy this fascinating conversation. Morgan Daimler, thank you so much for coming on the show. Absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, I came across your work only recently, but you've been a voice in the pagan witchcraft, Celtic, fairy community for how long now?
Well, of how long I've been a voice is probably a debatable point, but I started teaching publicly about 20 years ago. I was right around 1999, 2000, and I published my first book in 2010.
Got it. And what was the first one on?
My very first book was on the Carmina Gadelica, which is a book of collected folk prayers from Scotland. So I sort of had a pagan perspective on that.
Were you practicing before you wrote that book, or did those things kind of happen in tandem with each other?
Nope. I got into practicing witchcraft more generally around 1991, 1992. And then from there, I had kind of segued into Celtic Reconstruction, probably the mid to later 90s. So that was sort of where I was coming from. And then the sort of incorporating the fairy faith and the fairy aspects of it has always been part of whatever I was doing. So
Gotcha. And where did the sort of beginnings of your interest in fairies happen?
That's a good question. It's a little complicated. I have kind of always, my entire life, had experiences around those sorts of beings and perceptions of them as far back as I can remember. I was one of those strange small children who would build little fairy houses and leave out little offerings for them, just kind of intuitively. I really didn't know what I was doing, but there was always sort of a thing for me. And then when I got older, I started to actually research. I grew up as part of the Irish American diaspora, so that was part of my base structure, sort of, for what they were and what was going on. But when I got older, I started really digging into fairy folklore and other people's beliefs around them and kind of all of that. And then I discovered witchcraft, and uh, sort of all of those things ended up getting blended together for me. So
Gotcha. So, okay, give me, I don't want this to sound as stupid as it probably will sound, but
that's okay.
give me just like your total novice introduction to fairies. What are they in terms of, you know, your current understanding? What's the difference between fairies and say changelings or fae? And how are you, or have you integrated fairies with your overall spiritual picture?
Okay.
Big
You
question.
asked, yeah, you asked a bunch of really big, complicated
I
questions.
did. I did.
Basically, fairy is just a catch-all kind of term for otherworldly beings, beings that are not from this world or this reality initially, but can come here and interact here and have various influences here.
Mm,
Um, Generally speaking, because it's a sort of general term and it's been used that way for hundreds and hundreds of years. The word fairy in English goes back to the 13th century, I believe. We stole it from the French because that's what the English language likes to do. So it's sort of one of those terms that when we look at the older material, the traditional material, folklore, um, because it's a generic, it gets equated to other things all the time. So you'll see a lot of times, because you'd mentioned the word fae. Fae is actually the French word that we took and then made into fairy in English.
oh,
So those terms are kind of synonymous for the most part. They both mean basically the same thing. And then you have other terms like elf, which comes from Germanic languages, but kind of came into English and gets used as an equivalent. So you can find older texts that use these terms all in one passage, kind of meaning the same creature or the same being.
hmm,
And initially, the words were an adjective. They were just used to describe something that had that sort of otherworldly nature to it, that wasn't from here, so to
hmm,
speak. And then kind of later on, it came to mean as a noun that specific kind of being itself. So when I use the word, that's pretty much where I'm coming at it from. It's a general term. It applies to a lot of different things. So then we can get into all the specific types of fairies and all of that. And there's many of them. And of course, you can look outside English-speaking cultures and find equivalents where the word fairy would be what we would translate the term in that culture that they would use,
hmm.
because it's the closest sort of English word that we would have for whatever the word in the other languages. And I am a huge linguistic nerd, so I promise I will not like go off on a tangent about that. But how that all got incorporated into my witchcraft, there's so much folklore and so much folk belief relating to these beings and sort of how to safely interact with them and how to um, deal with them when they're not being safe, how to protect yourself, or how to sort of, nurture potentially a better relationship with them. And there's a lot of evidence, particularly from England and Scotland, and less so from Ireland, but it is still there, of witches historically having worked with these beings. That was sort of a thing that has happened over hundreds of years, that people would connect to them, particularly to learn specific knowledge, often related to healing or plants, but not always. And there's indications that it could be a lot older even than the evidence that we have for it. A friend of mine who blogs at Seo Helruna is the name of her blog. Um, they've done some really good work about this sort of thing, witches and elves, in Anglo-Saxon and Norse culture, which goes back a lot further, at least 1,000 years. So kind of looking at all of that and putting all that together, it just sort of made sense for me because I was already having these experiences and sort of perforce having to deal with these beings. And then when witchcraft sort of became my spirituality and my practice, it was only natural for me to incorporate them together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So what does that incorporation look like practically? Are you sort of doing rituals to communicate? Is that sort of how it manifests itself?
It manifests itself in a lot of different ways. The way that I approach ritual structure itself is kind of based on my study in this area and my perception in this area. So, like, I don't cast a circle the way a lot of witches traditionally would, or use the idea of a compass in the same way. I sort of have a different approach to that. I do it, but I don't do it the same way. I don't invoke elements and
Mm-hmm.
any of that kind of thing. And it sort of has a different purpose to it. It's a lot about trying to build connections and I guess sort of allies or friendships, like connecting to the spirits in the house, connecting to the spirits and fairies around me, in a more general sense, like in my yard and my neighborhood, because they're everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, didn't mean that to sound as weirdly creepy as it just did. But
There's one behind me right now.
you never know. Yeah, but it's that sort of idea of connecting to them and building a more positive relationship to them. So making offerings. I recently I'd gone to Iceland in 2018 with my friend coincidentally who writes the blog I just mentioned, and a few other people. And while I was there, I'd had an experience relating to the fall equinox and the Pleiades, the constellation, and that sort of completely changed how I look at the ritual year. So I've kind of switched from a solar lunar kind of timing into a stellar timing. So I do things by the constellations now,
Huh.
and that I entirely blame on the fairies, on the
Huh.
fair folk, because that was very much inspired by a particular thing that happened kind of with them. So
So do they ever act as sort of like in the way that spirit guides kind of you hear about performing, where one or a few might recur to you over and over again in sort of a protection-y way, or is it less personal than that?
I wouldn't use the term spirit guide necessarily because I think people have different associations with that.
Sure.
And fairies, just by their nature, they can be helpful, but they can also be dangerous, and they can cause harm. So I don't want to give people the wrong impression, but there certainly are ones over the decades that I've been doing this who are I have regular experiences with. I do a lot with dream work and meditation and journey work and that sort of thing. And with those, I think in the looser sense of what you had just said, you could use that sort of description, but they're not spirit guides in the sense of they're not trying to help me be like the best person that I can be or the best human I can be. They're not trying to help my consciousness evolve, or at least as far as I'm aware, they're not.
Mm.
But they'll teach me things, practical things usually. This is something that's up on my blog, so it's like public knowledge at this point. But I had a dream, for example, where one of the other crowd, one of the fairies that is kind of a guide, I guess we could say, for me, had come to me and shown me how to make a kind of cake. And for the record, I don't cook. I don't bake. I'm one of those people that is a little dangerous in the kitchen. But in the dream, it was very clear that it was like this much flour and these many eggs and this much honey. And I woke up and I'm like, I don't even know if that's food. Like, I don't know if I don't know if you could turn those ingredients into something edible, um, but I figured I would try, just to see. And it turns out, yeah, it if you follow it the way that I was told how to do it, it actually bakes up into this nice little cake. It's really sweet because there's a ton of honey in it.
Uh-huh.
But in the dream, I was given to me as like, use this as an offering, make these for offerings. It was something that they wanted. They actually are pretty good though, so sometimes I make them just to eat them because they're yummy.
Offering to
Um,
yourself.
right. But that's more the kind of stuff, when they come in to teach. It's practical things like that. It's not necessarily like, you need to meditate more to become a better, calmer person.
Right.
I could probably use some of that.
So, how have fairies interacted with the unconscious or subconscious mind in your experience working with them? I know you said they pop up in dreams and sometimes in meditation. Is that are there other ways that you've seen them sort of playing on a deeper substructure mentally?
I definitely think that they can connect to people and influence people in those ways. Um, I think they have a lot of ability when it comes to things like getting you to notice synchronicities,
Hmm.
drawing your attention to things which are probably always there, but you just don't see them unless they're kind of being highlighted.
Hmm.
Definitely the dreams. And again, that's one of those things that in modern terms, we tend to be very rational about dreams. We tend to view dreams as this is just your subconscious working itself out. But that's actually a really recent view. It kind of came in as psychology was developing, which is as much as I love it because it was my major, but it is a fairly recent entry into the field, as it were. Previously it used to be that people took dreams very, very seriously. And there's quite a few good articles out there discussing how um, people would treat dreams as if they were waking interactions. That's part of the reason when we look at some of the witchcraft trial material and there's these accusations of people going out like in their sleep, or someone having a dream of their neighbor coming to them and tormenting them. That's part of what was taken so seriously, because at that time period, like as far as they were concerned, that really happened. That
Hmm.
was a real thing that happened. Whereas today we often have a different perspective on it. But I do find that the fairies, that is one way that they'll communicate and reach out to people. Um, and the idea, of course, that when you're sleeping, your soul can leave your body and sometimes wander off, have its
Right.
little adventures.
Right. Have you, so you were a psychology major, so have you done a lot of work on sort of the psychological interplay between fairies and I don't know, cognitive processes? I'm sort of thinking of Jung and archetypes and how that might play up with fairies.
Um, I definitely think that, you know, if Jung can, well, he did get into the folklore aspects of things, but I do think fairies, if we choose to look at them through that lens, fall into certain specific archetypes. Sometimes some of the shadow archetypes, in particular, the more subconscious negative ones that we try to not acknowledge and resist. Um, I also think if we look at the sort of the wider pattern of um, fairy belief and how people over the course of centuries have related to fairies, fairies often exemplify sort of what's repressed in a particular human community.
Hmm.
So, there's examples of fairies in particular parts of England where, during specific time periods that were, we'll just say, very religious, where people weren't supposed to dance. Um, and then you see all these stories of people having these encounters with dancing fairies.
Hmm.
And it's sort of shows that they will often appear as the um, almost the animus aspect of the human society around them that's being repressed. We see the same thing when it comes to like sexuality and gender roles. Um, of course, looking at it from a modern lens, we don't always understand it because you're using that context. But if you understand the context, you can see that pattern. We see a lot of stories. Again, I'm looking more at England here, but of male fairies appearing in very domestic roles that normally would have been women's roles in that culture. So it would be really unusual, in like 16th century England, for men to do certain tasks or to be in certain places. And that's where we'll find male fairies. And in the same way, we see female fairies kind of out doing the things that in the culture at the time they would expect men to do. So
Hmm.
sort of flipping that that gender role. But again, in our modern terms, that doesn't seem so shocking.
Right.
We're a little more freeform with our gender roles in the 21st century, but back then it definitely would have struck people as, this is something that we as humans can't do, but they can do it. Fairies can do it.
Hmm.
So
Is that sort of the way in which they can be dangerous? Is that they come to embody these repressed parts of ourselves, and maybe interacting with that before you're ready can have long-term harm?
that's definitely some of it, I think, and we do see a lot of stories of people who have these experiences or these interactions, or deal with the world of fairy or visit the world of fairy even, and then end up pining away, sort of lose their will to live in this world,
Hmm.
because they sort of can't reconcile the human reality that they're in compared to the fairy reality that they would rather be in. I mean, we also see fairy stories and anecdotal accounts that are much more directly dangerous to the physical being. There's types of fairies that just flat out eat people.
No.
There has been supposition over the years, because a lot of them are water fairies, that this might have at some point represented like people trying to particularly warn children to stay away from, like, don't go near that river because there's a hag in it and she'll eat you,
Right.
or don't go near that lake because there's a kelpie in it and it'll eat you. You know, depending on whether you're looking at fairies as real beings that have agency and interact with humans, or as just aspects of human understanding of the world. But that certainly has been, is a supposition that's out there.
Hmm. I'm gonna pause for 1 second if that's okay. My cat is trying desperately to get out of my room. Making all kind of noise. I'll be right back.
Sure.
Oh, thanks. All right. It's been taken care of. Okay.
I totally understand. I have cats
Yeah.
and children, so
Oh, how many of each?
2 cats and 3 children.
Oof, that's a lot.
It's rolling chaos at all times.
I'm sure. 2 cats is enough for me at the moment, I think. Um,
That's a good choice.
so are you a New Englander?
Yes.
Are you from the area?
I was born in Maine originally,
Oh,
and I still have family up there, and now I'm living more in the southeast of New England.
gotcha. That's
I'm a little,
also where I'm living.
yeah.
Um, so have you been to Salem?
I have, not in a long time at this point. I went a couple times in 2003, but I haven't been able to get back up there, and I would direct you again to the 3 children part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your takeaway when you did go? Were you a fan of it? Did you have a good time? What'd you think of it?
I did have a good time. I I think that my opinion is a little broad.
All right.
I definitely loved the history. I thought being there and visiting it and seeing the locations and the places. I did the little trolley tour. That was very cool. I went in, of course, to a lot of the stores and the various museums. And I mean, in that aspect, it's like anything else, anywhere else you're going to go. Some were definitely much more interesting than others.
Right.
you know, but it's worth visiting, I think. particularly if you're a pagan in the United States, just to go to understand the history a little better. Because I'm constantly shocked by the sort of misinformation that's out there when it comes to Salem and the witchcraft trials.
You'd be shocked.
Oh,
The things
I
I
see.
hear from people.
Yeah, I would believe it because I see it all the time. People talking about, the witches that were burned in Salem. It's like,
Yeah,
oh
yeah.
no.
And that is the big one. And the second big one I hear a lot is not knowing that the executions and arrests and the entire affair were conducted against all members of the community, children, men, women. I mean, there was a 4-year-old arrested and put in prison and almost executed, and she never recovered from it. She was
Yeah.
totally destroyed by the experience. So yeah, burning. I hear a lot of burning. Um, I hear a lot of this. Honestly, does surprise me, but I think there's something about the nature of modern Salem that kind of lends to this idea, um, which is that the people who were executed were actual witches, which is a kind of a complicated thing to dispute because there isn't one angle from which you can look at it and it is true, but it's not usually the angle people mean when they say that.
Right.
So I hear that all the time too. Um, but as a practicing, were you practicing it back when you were in Salem in
Yeah.
2000, early
Yeah.
2000s?
2003.
Did you find it to be a sort of authentic experience as a practicing witch at that time?
I feel like this question is a trap.
I'm not trying to trap you. I'm really not. I'm just
I
curious. I'm curious about practicing today and in the
Yeah.
past, because it's obviously a lot different now than it was back then. But back
Right.
then, how did it
Right.
feel to you?
Um, I think aspects of it felt very sincere and very genuine. Um, Others maybe not so much. Um, I think that it kind of ran that whole spectrum. And there were certainly a couple places I went to that were not promoting the best history
Mm,
necessarily either. So
yeah, yeah, it's definitely true. Um, okay, so I want to switch to an article that you recently published on Pathos, and it was titled "Irish American Witchcraft: Aesthetic Witches, Basic Witches, and Gatekeeping." It's a fantastic article, by the way. Absolutely adored
thank
it.
you.
It's why I asked you to come on the show. I loved it. I've read it like 4 times. Can you
Thank you.
just briefly break down the distinction that you make in that article between aesthetic and basic witches?
So, I mean, these are sort of pop culture terms, which means the definitions can be a little vague. If you know, look to the great oracle of Google for this, you're going to get sort of a range of answers. Um, Generally speaking, though, aesthetic witchcraft is this concept of adopting sort of the appearance and the things that are associated with witchcraft without necessarily adopting the substance of it. So people who may, really like to dress the way they think that a stereotypical witch would dress, and like the big pentacle and cauldrons and herbs and um, candles and sort of all of that, the aesthetic. But they may not really know or have much depth of knowledge relating to the actual practice or spirituality of witchcraft. It becomes sort of like a costume
Hmm.
or like a dress. In contrast to that, basic witchcraft kind of grew out of the idea of calling things basic to imply that they were sort of shallow and simple and didn't have a lot of substance to them. And there can be some crossover when people are hurling insults between aesthetic and basic witchcraft, but it's become more of a thing because it's sort of a convenient way to imply that someone maybe is practicing witchcraft or is into the spirituality, but only on the surface. They really don't have much depth to them. They don't really maybe know what they're doing. They're just sort of trendy.
Hmm.
It's kind of what we would have called, 10, 20 years ago, like Insta witches, or, I read a book witches. I think those terms have phased out. Now we have basic witches.
I like that one. I haven't heard that one. I read a
Oh
book,
yeah.
which is
Oh yeah. Yeah.
that's
There's
good.
there's there's always something. Um, and really the point I was making in the whole article, because a lot of people who get accused of being aesthetic witches or basic witches are younger people,
Hmm.
people in their teens, people in their early 20s. Aesthetic witchcraft in particular is huge on certain social media platforms that are mostly populated by people in their teens or early 20s. So it's become this sort of way to kind of gatekeep and be like, well, these people aren't really serious practitioners. These people are just following the fad, or they're just trendy. They just like the look of it. They're not like serious. They're not, suffering for their
Right.
witchcraft.
Right.
And I've always been a big proponent of witchcraft needing to be something that was accepting of diversity and was accepting of kind of that full range. You're always going to have people who are just casual, that they do like it, they are interested in it, it is their spirituality or their practice, but it's not their life. you know
Hmm.
um I don't think there's anything wrong with that, personally.
Yeah. I mean, I
Go.
can understand the impulse to the gatekeeping if you have constructed, witchcraft down into the pillars of your being. It might feel
Right.
a little, you know, intrusive or unearned for someone to suddenly come along and say that because they read a book, they're sort of at the same level of understanding as you are.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so do you think there are places where it's this kind of gatekeeping is appropriate? Like I'm thinking specifically of, a sort of mentor experience where you don't want to reveal too much too soon, and there's a sort of gatekeeping that's in place to keep that from happening. Do you think that sort of thing is appropriate in the larger witchcraft community, or is this sort of general disdain for basic or aesthetic witches just all around? Just we should just be rid of it because it's keeping people from entering into the fray potentially.
Well, I mean, my biggest concern with the gatekeeping, specifically with the aesthetic and so-called basic witches, is that it really puts people off who are just starting out and who might actually have found a real spirituality and a real practice with witchcraft over time. Because these are almost always people who are very, very new.
Hmm.
I emphasize almost always, but it's usually people, like I said, they're younger, they're newer. This is something they're just sort of discovering. And I hate to see that squashed, with this idea of, well, you're kind of not good enough
Right.
for us, so go find something else. And they will, if you have enough people telling you, you know, we don't accept you, they'll go find something else. And that I don't agree with. Gatekeeping in a wider sense, I do think there's positive aspects to it. If you belong to a particular tradition that requires initiation, then yeah, you have every right to say, you're not in our tradition unless you follow our procedures and check all the boxes and all of that. If someone is dangerous, if they've caused physical, particularly physical, but any other kind of harm to other people, then, I think that a community has the right to say, we don't want that here. I think it's a little more complicated with disavowing someone, because I have seen that happen where people try to say, well, they're just not a witch. They're not practicing witchcraft. I mean, even if they're a terrible, terrible person, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not a witch,
Right.
you know? But we can say we don't want them in our community or at events or, what have you, if they're dangerous, or, for any other reason that would make sense to prevent any kind of harm
Hmm.
to people.
Yeah.
So
Makes sense. So you've got in October of this year, you've got Pagan Portals, Raven Goddess going deeper with Morgan
Mhm.
coming out. Is this your second look at Morgan?
That is a follow-up, yes, to my Pagan Portals, The Morgan Meeting the Great Queen, which came out, I believe, in 2014.
And what's the reason for revisiting?
Um, the Pagan Portals series, it's a series that Moon Books does. And they're meant to be sort of introductory books. They're very short. They run about 25,000, 26,000 words, which works out to roughly 80 to 90 pages. So the first book was really just a look at who the Morgan is in mythology, about goddesses that are often confused with her and are connected to her in various ways, and then sort of a brief look at the different mythology that she does show up in and how people can potentially connect to her in the modern world. But I had always thought afterwards that at some point I would like to do another book kind of following it up because there was so much I just couldn't get into.
Hmm.
So in this second one, I get a lot more in depth on, for example, like colors that are associated with her, um, animals that are associated with her through the different forms that she takes. I dig into some of the misconceptions about her that have gotten really popular. And I'm being careful how I say this because I I don't want to criticize people's personal approaches
Sure.
to their spirituality. And if these are things that work for individuals, it's not meant to be a you're naughty and you shouldn't do that. It's more trying to sort of disambiguate, dig into things that are being perpetuated as this is historical, this is how she is in the mythology, which isn't accurate.
All
Um,
right.
so things like her as a sex goddess, which has gotten really popular, her as a mother goddess, kind of digging into those topics and sort of seeing what we actually have in the mythology and what that tells us. And then people can go wherever they want from there. So that's sort of more the second book. Um, and there's also certain things that people will say are in the mythology that just aren't. For the record, my super weird personal hobby, I translate Old Irish for fun.
No way.
I do. Because
Wow.
everybody needs a weird personal hobby.
That's a good one.
And I've been doing that now for, oh God, I think 6 years.
Wow.
Is when I started doing the translations. So with a lot of this, I went back to the original mythology in the original language and kind of looked at what it said. And, some of the things that people are saying are from the mythology. They just aren't, and it's not to say whether you should or shouldn't believe it today. Just we need to be really clear, I think, so that we're not kind of making up Irish mythology.
Hmm.
That's not fair to Irish culture.
Hmm.
That's naughty. So that is
Yeah.
naughty, I will say. Um, so that's kind of what the second book is more about, getting into all that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. And if anyone watching or listening to this podcast was interested in learning more about, let's do fairies and Celtic / Irish mythology as two separate sort of categories. Where would they start with your body of work?
Okay. With my body of work for fairies, I have a book called Fairies, A Guide to the Celtic Fair Folk. Particularly for pagans, I think that's a good one to start with because I get a little more in that one into practical, what to do, what not to do, to kind of engage with the fair folk. I also have a book that just came out in February called A New Dictionary of Fairies. Um, that's a little more on the looking at specific ones, looking at some of the wider tropes that we find in folklore and getting into all of that. But those two would probably be the ones that I would point people towards. I do write about my particular type of witchcraft, which I call fairy witchcraft, which I realize there's like 5 other tradition is also called fairy witchcraft, but here we are. Um, but I would say start with those first, and then if you're interested in other stuff, get into the other stuff. And besides that, with the Irish and Celtic, I do have quite a few pagan portals out at this point that are specifically about Irish gods. I have one that's Irish gods and goddesses, and then I have the one on the Morgan, as you mentioned. I have one on the Dagda, who's the Morgan's husband. I have one on Manon and MacLear. I have one on Brigid, sorry.
Mhm.
And I also have a book just on Irish paganism, kind of more generally. So, those would all kind of be possible go-tos. My translation stuff I have books for, and I also do a lot of that free online. So,
Wow.
if that interests you.
You have written a lot since you started writing.
I have.
Do you write every day? Are you one of those, like, I have hours set apart every day to crank it out?
Yeah. My middle child has some health issues. So in 2011, I had to stop working to kind of stay home and do the parenting thing, which is awesome. But I'm not the sort of person who does well with nothing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I started writing. It's basically my full-time job at this point. I've written, I believe it's 30 books at this point. 7 of those are fiction, because I do have a little fiction series that I do. All the rest are nonfiction, the translation stuff and the Pagan Portals and all of that. So
Wow. Congratulations. That's a lot of writing in that amount of time.
Yeah, you got to keep busy,
You do, don't you? Well, thank you so much. Is there anything besides the next Morgan book coming out that you would like our audience to be aware of?
I have the Raven Goddess book comes out in September, early October, depending on when Amazon actually decides to start selling it. They're fun like that. I have a book called Living Fairy, which is coming out in December. And that's about some of this Pleiades star holiday stuff that I was talking about. And then next April, I think it's April. Next April, I have a book on Lu, the Irish god Lu. These are all pagan portals coming out. So that's kind of everything I have at the moment. I'm working on my next novel that'll be out at some point, but I'm not sure exactly when. So I can't give a specific date for that one.
Wow. Well, thank you again so much. This was a fascinating conversation from a total fairy novice. I feel like I learned a whole lot. So thank you for coming on the show, Morgan.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this was great.
Thank you so much for listening to The Weekly Witch. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find out way more at tosalem.com or by checking out the various social platforms To Salem is on, which are, in order of how frequently they are used, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can support this show and everything else To Salem is producing by becoming a patron on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time, witches.